September 19th, 1846, Monterrey, Mexico. This is not Palo Alto. There is no flat prairie here, no open ground where artillery can maneuver at range and cut down formations at 1,000 yards. The flying guns that swept Arista's army from the field 4 months ago are nearly useless in these streets. Monterrey is a real city, population 15,000, the largest city in northern Mexico. It sits in a natural bowl formed by the Sierra Madre Mountains to the west, the Santa Catarina River to the south. The approaches are commanded by fortified hills. The streets are narrow, built for colonial-era foot traffic, lined with stone and adobe buildings whose walls are thick enough to stop rifle fire. Every roof is a firing position. Every doorway is a fatal funnel. General Pedro de Ampudia has 7,000 soldiers here. He has had months to prepare. He has turned this city into a fortress, not the clean kind with walls and towers that European military theory describes, but the chaotic, organic kind, where every building has been loopholed, where every alley has been barricaded, where the defenders know exactly where every street leads and the attackers do not. Zachary Taylor has 6,600 men outside the city. He has his artillery, which will matter on the fortified hills but almost not at all in the streets. He has infantry, some of the best professional soldiers in North America. He has Texas Rangers, who are the most effective and the most terrifying fighters in his force. And he has a problem. The problem is that nobody in Taylor's army has any real experience with urban warfare. The battles at Palo Alto and Resaca were textbook, 2 forces in the open, the better artillery winning the day. What happens in Monterrey will not be textbook. It will be improvised, brutal, confused, and conducted at ranges measured in feet rather than hundreds of yards. It will last 3 days.
And at the end of it, Taylor will make a decision that will infuriate the President of the United States and divide American opinion. A decision that will reveal the fundamental difference between winning a battle and winning a war. This is video 31 of the Nostalgia History Mexican-American War series. The war that Polk manufactured, the battles that started it, and now the city where it got complicated. The city. Why Monterrey was different. Monterrey in 1846 was not a frontier settlement. It was a colonial city founded in 1596 with 250 years of architecture behind it. The buildings were stone and adobe, thick-walled against the desert heat, with flat roofs designed for sleeping on summer nights. The streets were laid out in the Spanish colonial grid pattern, straight, predictable, crossing at right angles, which sounds orderly until you are trying to advance down one of them under fire. The geography worked in the defenders' favor at almost every level. The city sat on relatively flat ground, but it was hemmed in on multiple sides by features that Ampudia had fortified aggressively. To the northwest, the Citadel, a massive unfinished cathedral that had been converted into a fort, called the Black Fort by American soldiers because of the dark stone of its walls. To the west, 2 commanding hills, Independence Hill, crowned by the Bishop's Palace, a substantial stone structure with thick walls, and Federation Hill, lower but still defensible. To the east, the city's buildings themselves, loopholed and barricaded. A besieging force had to deal with all of these simultaneously. You couldn't simply surround the city and starve it out. You'd be taking fire from the citadel and the hills the whole time. You couldn't assault the city center without first taking the hills, because the hills commanded the approaches. You couldn't take the hills without dividing your force and leaving part of it exposed. Taylor's plan acknowledged this complexity. He would attack in 2 simultaneous directions. General William Worth's division would move to the west and southwest, cutting the Saltillo Road that was Ampudia's supply and escape route and assaulting the western hills. Taylor himself would press from the east, using the 1st Division and the Texas Rangers to push into the city's eastern quarters and draw Mexican attention while Worth worked around the flank. It was a sound plan. It was also a plan that depended on both halves working simultaneously in difficult terrain against prepared defenders. When things went wrong, and things went wrong, the plan's sound structure didn't prevent casualties.
General Pedro de Ampudia, the defender. Pedro de Ampudia was one of the most experienced combat commanders in the Mexican army. He was 45 years old, Cuban-born, and had spent his adult life fighting in Mexico's wars. He had commanded troops in Texas in 1836. He had a reputation for ruthlessness that was partly earned. He had been responsible for the execution of Texan prisoners at Goliad in 1836 on Santa Anna's orders, a history that Taylor soldiers were aware of. He was also a genuinely capable defensive tactician. The preparation of Monterrey's defenses showed an understanding of how to use urban terrain that most Mexican commanders of his era had not developed. He had loopholed buildings, he had built earthwork barriers across key intersections. He had positioned his artillery to cover every major approach. He had stocked the city with enough supplies to withstand a siege. What he could not fully control was the political environment in Mexico City, which continued to constrain his operational freedom, and the behavior of his troops under sustained pressure. Some of his units were excellent, some were not. In the chaos of 3-day urban combat, the difference between excellent and not excellent could be measured in street corners. The Texas Rangers, the most complicated soldiers in Taylor's army. Among the most consequential and most troubling elements of Taylor's force at Monterrey were the Texas Rangers. The Rangers were genuinely effective fighters. They were experienced in exactly the kind of close, fast, mobile combat that urban warfare demanded. They had grown up in environments where survival depended on quick decision-making and accurate shooting at short range. They knew the South Texas terrain. They had fought the Comanche. They were, in purely tactical terms, formidable. They were also men who carried with them a deep personal hatred of Mexico and Mexicans, rooted in the Texas Revolution and the decade of raids and massacres that had followed. The Alamo, Goliad, the Council House fight, the years of Comanche violence in which many of them had lost family members, all of this had created a group of fighters for whom the enemy was not just military but racial and cultural. Taylor understood this. He had seen what Rangers did in the aftermath of battles. He had written to Washington about it. He had issued orders. The orders were frequently not followed. At Monterrey, the Rangers would be at the center of the most brutal phase of the fighting, and at the center of the most serious allegations of atrocity against Mexican civilians. General William Worth, Taylor's most effective division commander at Monterrey, responsible for the Western attack that proved decisive. Worth was 52 years old, West Point educated, a veteran of the War of 1812 and the Seminole Wars. He was aggressive, politically ambitious, and skilled at the kind of complex multi-element operations that the Western attack required. His successful assault on the Bishop's Palace and Federation Hill is considered one of the finest small-unit tactical achievements of the entire war. He would later become the subject of a court-martial dispute with Winfield Scott, military politics at its most corrosive, and died of cholera in 1849, his reputation not quite what it deserved to be. The Eastern Assault, what street fighting actually feels like. Taylor's Eastern Assault began on the morning of September 19th. The 1st Division, under General David Twiggs, pushed toward the city from the east while the Texas Rangers attempted to work around the northern edge. It went wrong almost immediately. The approach to the eastern city outskirts ran across open ground dominated by the Black Fort to the northwest. The fort's artillery opened up on the advancing American columns as soon as they came within range. Men fell. The formation began to break up as soldiers instinctively sought cover, any cover, in the flat, exposed terrain between the American lines and the city's edge. Inside the city's eastern quarters, things were worse. Mexican riflemen had turned the rooftops into firing positions and the barricaded cross streets into death traps. The streets were eerily empty of civilians, but full of fire. Shots coming from above, from windows, from gaps in walls, from positions that were almost impossible to pinpoint until someone was already hit. American soldiers discovered, under fire, the technique that would define the battle. You could not advance down a street. What you could do was advance through buildings. Using axes, crowbars, pickaxes, whatever was available, soldiers broke holes through the shared walls between buildings, moving from house to house while staying off the streets entirely. It was slow, exhausting, disorienting. You never knew what was on the other side of the wall you were breaking through. You broke through, you looked, you either fired or you moved. Grant, serving with the 4th Infantry, described this technique in his memoirs with the precision of someone who had participated in it. He also described commandeering a horse at one point and riding back to Taylor's headquarters carrying a dispatch, riding with one hand on the horse's neck and both feet hooked on the far side of the animal, using the horse's body as cover against the rifle fire from the rooftops. It was the kind of improvised survival technique that soldiers develop when the tactical manual has run out of relevant entries. The Rangers in the city, effectiveness and atrocity. The Texas Rangers entered the eastern city alongside the regular infantry, and their effectiveness was immediately apparent. They moved through the streets and buildings with a confidence and speed that the regular infantry could not match. They were, in a real sense, exactly the right kind of fighters for this environment.
They were also the wrong kind of fighters in another, more troubling sense. Mexican civilian accounts from Monterrey, collected in the years after the battle, describe Rangers killing civilians, not in the heat of battle, not in mistaken identification, but deliberately. Looting, assault, murder of non-combatants in their homes. American officers also documented these incidents. Lieutenant Daniel Harvey Hill, whom we met briefly in video 29, kept a diary during the Monterrey campaign in which he described specific incidents of Ranger violence against civilians with visible disgust. He was not alone. Multiple American regular Army officers wrote about their inability to control the volunteers and Rangers operating alongside them. Taylor's official reports acknowledged the problem in restrained language. He issued orders. The orders were not fully obeyed. The gap between what Taylor ordered and what happened in the streets of Monterrey is one of the most significant and most consistently ignored aspects of this battle's history.
Day 1's end. Tactical situation at nightfall. By the end of September 19th, the Eastern assault had made limited progress at significant cost. The 3rd Infantry had taken severe casualties fighting through the eastern outskirts. The Texas Rangers had penetrated some distance into the city, but at the cost of discipline and cohesion. The Black Fort was still in Mexican hands and still firing. Worth's western column had moved into position, but had not yet attacked the hills. That assault would come on the 20th. Both armies settled into something like a standoff for the night. Mexican and American positions were sometimes separated by a single building. Men who had been fighting each other at arm's length for 12 hours were now close enough to hear each other breathe through the walls. Worth's western attack, Federation Hill. Worth's division moved before dawn on September 20th. His objective was to get between Monterrey and the Saltillo Road, to cut the city off from reinforcement and supply, and then to assault the western hills that commanded the city's approaches. The approach took Worth's men through the rocky terrain west of the city, climbing in darkness toward Federation Hill. The Mexican defenders on the hill were alerted, but the darkness and the broken ground worked in Worth's favor. It was difficult to direct effective fire against an enemy you could hear but not consistently see. Federation Hill fell to Worth's assault in the morning of September 20th. The Mexican garrison, outnumbered and flanked, retreated toward Independence Hill and the Bishop's Palace. Worth consolidated his position, and now the commanding artillery on Federation Hill was his, and those guns now pointed at Independence Hill across the valley. The Saltillo Road was cut. Ampudia's army in Monterrey was now isolated. The Bishop's Palace, the decisive assault. The Bishop's Palace on Independence Hill was the most formidable defensive position at Monterrey. The building itself was substantial, a large, thick-walled colonial structure that had served as an episcopal residence, now converted into a fortress with artillery mounted on its roof and defenders positioned in every window. To reach it, Worth's men had to climb a steep hillside under fire. The Mexican defenders on the palace walls had clear fields of fire down the slope. There was no cover on the hill itself. You either ran uphill and trusted your momentum to get you to the walls before enough of you were killed to break the assault, or you didn't go.
The assault went up in the late afternoon of September 20th. Worth's men climbed the hill at a run under continuous fire, carrying scaling ladders and axes. Mexican artillery fired from the rooftop. Mexican infantry fired from the windows. They reached the walls. The fighting at the walls was hand-to-hand, bayonet work, butt strokes, individual men making individual decisions in the chaos of a breach assault. The defenders had the advantage of position. The attackers had momentum and the specific kind of controlled aggression that well-trained soldiers develop under sustained stress. By nightfall on September 20th, the Bishop's Palace was in American hands. The flag that had flown over it, the Mexican tricolor, came down. An American flag went up. From the palace roof, Worth's artillery now commanded the entire western approaches to Monterrey. The city could not be resupplied, it could not be reinforced, and the guns on the hill could fire down into streets and plazas that had been, until this moment, completely sheltered from American fire. The Eastern battle continues, room by room. While Worth was fighting on the hills, the Eastern battle had ground on through the 20th and into the 21st. The technique of breaking through walls had become standardized.
American soldiers moved through the eastern quarters of the city, building by building, street by street, sometimes a single block in a full day of fighting. The Mexican defenders made every inch costly. They had retreated to the buildings closest to the central plaza, the inner core of the city, where the cathedral and the government buildings formed a natural redoubt. Every building they had abandoned had been prepared to slow the American advance. Furniture piled against doors, furniture dumped on stairs, sniper positions on upper floors covered by men who would fight until they were killed or driven out. Grant was in this fighting. He described moving through the city's eastern quarters, watching officers trying to maintain formation and direction in an environment where orientation was nearly impossible. The streets looked alike. The buildings looked alike. You could spend an hour working through a block and not know whether you had moved north or east or been working in circles. The men doing this fighting were tired. They had been in the city for 2 days. They were carrying heavy equipment in September heat. They were under fire from positions they often couldn't see. And they kept going.
September 22. The Convergence begins. By the morning of September 22nd, the tactical situation had shifted decisively in the Americans' favor. Worth's division, having taken the western hills and cut the Saltillo Road, was now pressing into the western quarters of the city from above. Taylor's eastern force had pushed through most of the city's eastern and northern quarters. The Mexican defenders were being compressed toward the central plaza, the cathedral square, the seat of civic and religious life in Monterrey, the last defensible position. The fighting on September 22nd was the most intense of the 3-day battle. Both American columns were pressing inward simultaneously, and the Mexican defenders were fighting with the specific ferocity of men who understood that the ground behind them was running out. American artillery was brought into the streets on September 22nd. This was not the flying artillery of Palo Alto, maneuvering at range across open ground. These guns were being pushed and pulled through narrow streets by teams of men, around corners, into intersections, pointed at the barricaded entrances to the plaza, and fired at close range. The effect on the barricades was decisive. The effect on anything near the barricades was catastrophic. Fighting through the cathedral district. The approach to the central plaza from the east required crossing a series of streets that Ampudia's defenders had prepared with particular care. The main road into the plaza was barricaded with earth and stone. The buildings on either side were loopholed and manned. The plaza itself, the open ground in front of the cathedral, was a killing zone. American soldiers solved the killing zone problem the same way they had solved the street problem. They went around it. While some units drew the defenders' fire with direct approaches to the barricades, other units worked through buildings on the flanks, emerging into the back sides of the defensive positions. The fighting inside the cathedral district was the most intimate and most terrible of the entire battle. Men who had been shooting at each other through walls for 2 days were now in the same rooms, the same corridors. Some of the fighting was hand-to-hand. Some of it was bayonets in rooms too small to use a musket effectively. There are accounts from both sides of this phase of the battle. American soldiers' letters describing the strangeness of fighting inside a church, among the pews, with the altar visible at the far end. Mexican soldiers' accounts describing the same spaces from the other side. The cathedral itself was damaged, though not destroyed. The damage to the human beings inside it was a different matter. Ampudia's request for terms. On the morning of September 23rd, General Ampudia sent a message to Taylor requesting an armistice and negotiation of terms. The Mexican situation was, by this point, militarily untenable. The Saltillo Road was cut. The western hills were in American hands. The eastern and northern quarters of the city were in American hands. The central plaza was under fire from multiple directions. Ampudia's army was compressed into the heart of the city with no supply line, no reinforcement, and no realistic prospect of improvement. His request was not surrender. It was a request to negotiate the terms under which his army would evacuate the city. There was an important distinction, and it mattered. Taylor's options were reject the request and continue the assault until the Mexican force was destroyed or captured, or negotiate, accept Ampudia's evacuation of the city, and obtain control of Monterrey without the additional American casualties that finishing the assault would require. Taylor chose to negotiate. The armistice terms, what Taylor agreed to. The armistice agreed on September 24, 1846, had terms that would cause a political explosion back in Washington. The Mexican army would evacuate Monterrey with full military honors. They would march out with their weapons, their artillery, except for a few pieces left behind, their flags. They were specifically not prisoners of war. They were a defeated force that had been allowed to leave the field intact, on their honor not to fight the United States again until formally exchanged. An 8-week armistice would take effect during which no military operations would occur in the region. Taylor justified these terms on multiple grounds. He had taken significant casualties over 3 days of intense fighting. His ammunition supply was running low. The sustained house-to-house combat had consumed rounds at a rate that the supply chain had not anticipated. Finishing the assault against a desperate enemy fighting from the last defensible positions in the city would cost more American lives. And he, Taylor, the general on the ground, had calculated that the terms were acceptable. From a military standpoint, it was a defensible decision. From a political standpoint, it was a catastrophe. Polk's reaction: fury from Washington. President Polk received news of the armistice approximately 3 weeks after it was signed. His reaction was not measured. His diary entry describing his response to the terms Taylor had negotiated was one of the most scathing private assessments of a general's performance by a sitting president in American history.
Polk's objections were specific and had genuine military logic behind them. Taylor had let an entire army go. The Mexican force that marched out of Monterrey with its weapons and its artillery was not destroyed. It was an organized military unit that, despite its promise not to fight again until exchanged, would eventually return to the field. And indeed it would. Many of the soldiers who walked out of Monterrey under the armistice terms would be at Buena Vista 4 months later, fighting against Taylor again. The 8-week armistice suspended all military operations in the region at a moment when the campaign was going well. Polk had a 3-front strategy. The northern campaign was one element. Stopping it for 2 months allowed Mexico time to reorganize, reinforce, and prepare for the next phase, time that Polk calculated as squandered. And politically, allowing a defeated army to march out with its weapons and its flags was not the image of decisive American military power that the war's domestic political situation required. This war had opponents in the United States: Lincoln, Thoreau, Emerson, dozens of congressmen. Every time the war appeared to be something less than a clean military triumph, those opponents found new ammunition. Taylor's justification: the general on the ground. Taylor's defenders, then and in the historical literature sense, have made a case that deserves to be taken seriously. He had just fought 3 days of urban warfare against a prepared defensive force. His ammunition was genuinely running low. His casualty rate, while not catastrophic, had been significant, and continuing the assault into the prepared positions around the Central Plaza would have cost more lives. The Mexican force was going to get out of Monterrey regardless. The Saltillo Road ran west into the Sierra Madre, and if Ampudia's force had dispersed into the mountains in small groups, pursuing them would have been both dangerous and logistically impossible. Taylor also understood something about the long-term requirements of occupying northern Mexico that pure military logic might miss. He was going to be the administration authority in Monterrey and the surrounding region for the foreseeable future. He needed the civilian population's minimal cooperation, or at least their neutrality. An assault that ended with a prolonged artillery bombardment of the Cathedral District, with the subsequent street fighting visible to every citizen of Monterrey, would have poisoned the occupation before it began. Letting the army walk out with dignity, with military honors, was also a signal to the civilian population. This is an army that fights soldiers, not cities. It was, in other words, a peacekeeping calculation as much as a military one. What actually happened? Did Taylor's decision matter? History has a way of settling arguments that politics cannot. So what actually happened? The Mexican force that evacuated Monterrey did reform. Many of the soldiers did return to the field. Santa Anna, who had returned to Mexico from exile and assumed command of the Mexican army, gathered these troops and others for the campaign at Buena Vista in February 1847, where he nearly destroyed Taylor's smaller force in one of the most dramatic and costly battles of the entire war.
In that specific tactical sense, Polk was right. Letting the army go had consequences. But whether destroying Ampudia's force at Monterrey would have shortened the war is a genuinely uncertain historical question. Mexico was not going to surrender based on the outcome in Monterrey, regardless of how complete the American victory was. The decision to end the war was ultimately political, not military, and it would take Scott's capture of Mexico City to produce the political crisis in Mexico that made negotiation possible. Taylor's armistice delayed the northern campaign by 2 months. It may have cost American lives at Buena Vista. It also avoided significant American losses in the final assault on Monterrey's Central Plaza and preserved a minimal foundation for the occupation's civilian relationship. Was Taylor right? Historians have not reached consensus. That's a real answer, and it's worth saying so. What it meant for Taylor's career. The political consequence for Taylor was almost immediate. Polk was so furious about the armistice that he began maneuvering to shift the center of the war effort from Taylor's northern campaign to Winfield Scott's amphibious operation, the campaign that would land at Veracruz and march on Mexico City. This was militarily sound regardless of Monterrey, but it also had the convenient effect of taking away Taylor's strategic spotlight. Scott was given command of the principal campaign. Taylor's role in the war was effectively reduced after Monterrey. He would fight the dramatic and nearly disastrous Battle of Buena Vista, and then he was essentially sidelined while Scott finished the war. But here is the irony. The controversy over the armistice, Polk's fury, the political argument that followed, all of it made Taylor more popular, not less. American voters in 1848 did not care about the armistice's military implications. They cared that old Rough and Ready had taken Monterrey. They cared that a general who looked like a farmer in an old hat had beaten a Mexican army in a Mexican city and then been criticized by a Washington politician. Polk's fury helped make Taylor President of the United States. We have spent 4 sections on the battle. We have followed Taylor and Worth and Ampudia through 3 days of combat. We have counted American and Mexican military casualties. We have said almost nothing about the 15,000 people who lived in Monterrey before any soldier arrived. The civilians. What the battle felt like from inside. The population of Monterrey in September 1846 was predominantly Mexican, Spanish-speaking, Catholic, working class, and middle class, merchants, craftspeople, farmers who had come into the city, families who had lived there for generations, children, old people, pregnant women. When it became clear that a battle was imminent, some residents fled. They loaded whatever they could carry on mules and carts and left the city, heading north or south into the countryside. We don't know how many. Contemporary accounts suggest it was a minority. Most people, for reasons ranging from inability to leave to refusal to abandon their homes, stayed. They spent 3 days in a city that was being fought over, street by street. Think about what that means concretely. You are in your house, which is now a firing position. Soldiers, you do not know which side, may come through your door at any moment. The walls of your home may be broken through at any time by men with axes. You can hear gunfire in the next street. You can hear cannon fire. You cannot go outside. The streets are death. You cannot communicate with anyone outside your building. You have whatever food you prepared before the battle started. If it runs out, you have nothing. Civilian casualties, the uncounted. The official casualty counts for the Battle of Monterrey record military dead and wounded. American, 488. Mexican military, approximately 367. Mexican civilian casualties are not recorded in any official count. We know they occurred. Mexican accounts from the period, newspaper reports, personal testimony collected in the years afterward, the records of local priests who buried the dead, describe civilian deaths from artillery fire, from the fighting in and through buildings, from the rangers and volunteers who operated in the city's streets. How many civilians died in Monterrey during the 3 days of battle? We do not know the precise number. The absence of a count is itself a historical choice, a choice to make certain deaths invisible. The soldiers on both sides were counted because armies count their casualties. The civilians were not counted because no one in a position to count them had any institutional interest in the number. We can say with reasonable confidence that civilian deaths occurred, that they were not trivial in number, and that the rangers and volunteers were responsible for a portion of them in ways that went beyond military necessity. The occupation. What came after the battle? Taylor occupied Monterrey after the armistice. His army moved into the city. The soldiers who had been fighting through those buildings for 3 days were now living in them. The relationship between the occupying force and the civilian population was, by multiple accounts, tense at best. Some American soldiers were disciplined, some were respectful, some behaved as if the city and everything in it was property they had conquered. Taylor issued orders. He established military governance. He tried to maintain a minimum of order. The occupation of a city is harder than its conquest, and Taylor, a battlefield commander of genuine skill, was less well suited to the administrative and diplomatic demands of occupation than to the tactical demands of battle. The civilian experience of occupation, the daily reality of living under a foreign military force that had just fought a 3-day battle through your streets, is almost entirely unrecorded in English-language sources. Mexican accounts exist, but are rarely consulted. The story of Monterrey under occupation belongs to a history that hasn't yet been fully written.
Father Francisco Cardenas, the parish priest of Monterrey's Iglesia de la Purísima during the battle. His parish records from September-October 1846 include an unusual number of death entries for the battle period. Names, ages, causes of death were determinable. These records have been partially analyzed by local historians and represent one of the few surviving primary sources for civilian casualty data from the Battle of Monterrey. They document at least 23 civilian deaths that can be attributed to the battle period. The actual number is certainly higher. Father Cardenas continued his ministry throughout the occupation, recording baptisms and deaths as the occupiers and the occupied tried to establish a new, uncomfortable equilibrium. Sergeant John W. Lowe, U.S. 3rd Infantry. Sergeant Lowe was 27 years old, a professional soldier from Pennsylvania who had enlisted in 1840. He was in the 3rd Infantry's advance into the eastern city on September 19th, the assault that ran into the worst of the initial ambush fire. He survived. He wrote a letter home that was preserved in a family collection and later donated to the Pennsylvania State Archives. In it, he described the experience of advancing through the streets under fire with the specific, grounded clarity of a man who had processed trauma through the act of writing about it. He wrote, "The streets here are not like streets back home. They are killing places and nothing more. A man who shows himself in one is a dead man in a moment. We have learned to go through walls instead. It is slow and strange work, breaking through other people's houses, and I find myself wondering what happened to the family that lived here before we broke through their kitchen wall." That last sentence, "I find myself wondering what happened to the family," is one of the most morally aware observations in any American soldier's account of this battle. Lowe was in the middle of a brutal urban assault, and he was thinking about the people whose home he was destroying in order to survive. He was promoted to first sergeant before the war ended. He returned to Pennsylvania. The family whose kitchen wall he broke through was never identified. Lieutenant Colonel Jose Maria Garcia, 6th Infantry, Mexican Army. Garcia commanded a battalion holding positions in the eastern city during days 1 and 2. His official report, filed with the Mexican Army's records and partially reproduced in a Mexican military history published in 1875, describes the house-by-house fighting from the defender's perspective with the precision of a professional soldier. He wrote about his men's adaptation to the American tactics. Once the Americans began breaking through walls rather than advancing down streets, Mexican defenders had to respond by creating their own interior barriers, essentially walling off sections of buildings so that a breach in one room did not give access to the entire structure. He wrote about ammunition. Mexican infantry at Monterrey suffered from the same defective powder problem that had hampered Arista at Palo Alto. Not all of their cartridges were reliable. Men who were counting on their weapons to fire sometimes found that they did not.
He wrote about morale. His battalion, he noted, fought well on day 1 and day 2. By day 3, when the compression toward the central plaza was becoming apparent, morale was severely tested but maintained. His men held their positions until ordered to withdraw toward the plaza. Garcia survived the battle and the evacuation. His subsequent career is not documented in sources available outside Mexico. Maria de la Luz Perez. Maria de la Luz Perez was 41 years old, a widow, living on the Calle del Roble in Monterrey's eastern quarter with her 2 daughters, ages 14 and 16. Her name appears in Father Cardenas' parish records. She was baptizing her youngest granddaughter in a hurried ceremony on September 18th, the day before the battle began. The entry notes her name, her daughters' names, the infant's name. It is the last record of her that can be confirmed. She and her daughters were on Calle del Roble when the American assault pushed through the eastern quarter on September 19th and 20th. Whether they stayed in their house, sought shelter elsewhere, fled the city, or became casualties is unknown. Father Cardenas' death records do not include their names, which suggests they may have survived, but the records are incomplete and absence from the death register is not proof of survival. She was there. She had a name. She had daughters. She was trying to keep them alive in a city that was being fought over street by street. That is everything we know about her. The Rangers' other faces. We have described the Rangers as effective fighters with a brutal shadow. There is another face to record. Ben McCulloch was a Texas Ranger captain who served at Monterrey. He was an exceptional leader and a skilled reconnaissance commander. He had conducted the intelligence work that identified key Mexican defensive positions before the assault began. His contributions to the battle's tactical success were real and acknowledged. McCulloch also documented, in his own reports, the behavior of some Rangers under his command that he found unacceptable. He was not a soft man. He had fought Comanche raiders for years.
He had seen violence. When he wrote that some men under his command had behaved in ways that shamed Texas, the words carry weight. He continued to serve, continued to lead, continued to file careful reports. He was killed at the Battle of Pea Ridge in 1862, a Confederate general, shot by a sharpshooter. His career contains, in compressed form, the entire moral contradiction of the Texas Ranger institution: extraordinary tactical effectiveness, genuinely admirable personal courage, and institutional violence against civilians that cannot be separated from the effectiveness and the courage. Taylor had taken Monterrey. 3 days, 488 American casualties, street by street, room by room, wall by wall. Worth's flags on the Bishop's Palace, the Central Plaza in American hands, and an armistice that let 7,000 Mexican soldiers walk out of the city with their weapons and their flags. The controversy would follow Taylor back to Washington, or rather, it would arrive in Washington before he did, in Polk's diary and Polk's furious dispatches, and the political calculations of a president who understood that this war needed clean victories, not complicated ones. The military situation in northern Mexico was, objectively, improved. The city was held. The supply line to Saltillo was in American hands. The northern campaign had moved forward. But the war was not over. Mexico would not negotiate from the loss of Monterrey. The central government in Mexico City had survived. Santa Anna had returned, had seized power, and was raising a new army. An army that would include many of the men who had walked out of Monterrey under the Armistice terms.
In February 1847, 5 months after Monterrey, Taylor's reduced force, Polk had stripped it to build Scott's amphibious operation, would face that army at a mountain pass called Buena Vista. Santa Anna would come with 15,000 men. Taylor would have 4,700. Santa Anna would send Taylor a message before the battle: surrender or be destroyed. Taylor's reply, through his adjutant, was, "Go to hell." What happened next? 2 days of fighting in which Taylor's force nearly broke, then didn't, then won a battle it had no military right to win, is one of the great military stories of the entire war. Santa Anna had 15,000 men. Taylor had 4,700. On the morning of February 22, 1847, George Washington's birthday, the battle began. And in the crisis of that fight, a Mississippi colonel named Jefferson Davis would do something that would make him a national hero. Yes, that Jefferson Davis. Thank you for watching Nostalgia History. Monterrey is one of the most underappreciated battles in American history. 3 days of brutal urban warfare that changed how American soldiers understood what war actually was. If this video showed you something about that battle that your textbooks left out, subscribe, share, and leave a comment. And tell us, was Taylor right to let the Mexican army go? We've laid out the case on both sides. We genuinely don't know what you'll decide. That's the point. Some questions in history don't have clean answers. The ones that don't are usually the most important ones. Sergeant Lowe, Lieutenant Garcia, Maria de la Luz Perez, Father Cardenas. The city was taken. These people were in it. Remember them.